Welcome to episode 22 of the Pernicious Chattel channel, and this is part 4 of the Abolition of Work, an essay by Bob Black. In this essay, I will prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, why I am destined to remain in YouTube obscurity. Our author, Bob, is now getting really rolling into his essay and has gone from inserting many relevant, although challenging references, to inserting an absolute shit ton of thoroughly difficult references. Even with access to the modern internet and many hours of time, I've been struggling to find and understand many of them. None of this material is irrelevant, and it only serves to make his essay more convincing. But as an author, Bob's a little like me as a YouTuber. He makes things difficult for his audience. Nonetheless, if you feel you're up to having your mind expanded, then please come along. Quote, "To grasp the full enormity of our deterioration, however, consider the earliest condition of humanity, without government or property, when we wandered as hunter-gatherers. Hobbs surmised that life was then nasty, brutish, and short. Others assume that life was a desperate, unremitting struggle for subsistence, a war waged against harsh nature, with death and disaster awaiting the unlucky or anyone who is unequal to the challenge of struggle for existence. Actually, that was all a projection of fears for the collapse of government authority over communities unaccustomed to doing without it, like the England of Hobbs during the Civil War. Hobbes' compatriots have already encountered alternative forms of society which illustrated other ways of life, in North America particularly, but already these were too remote from their experience to be understandable. The lower orders, closer to the condition of the Indians, understood it better and often found it attractive. Throughout the 17th century, English settlers defected to Indian tribes or, captured in war, refused to return, but the Indians no more defected to white settlements than Germans climbed the Berlin Wall from the west. The survival of the fittest version, the Thomas Huxley version of Darwinism, was a better account of economic conditions in Victorian England than it was of natural selection. As the anarchist Kropotkin showed in his book Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution. Kropotkin was a scientist, a geographer, who'd had ample involuntary opportunity for field work whilst exiled in Siberia. He knew what he was talking about. Like most social and political theory, the story Hobbes and his successors told was really unacknowledged autobiography." Close quote. Whew, okay, Bob, that's a way to really stuff a paragraph. So let's start pulling this one apart. Thomas Hobbes of Moundsberry was born in 1588 and died in 1679. He was an English philosopher, considered to be one of the founders of modern political philosophy. Hobbes is best known for his 1651 book Leviathan, in which he expounds an influential formulation of social contract theory. Hobbes is very unpopular with the left, as he postulated that man in a state of nature, that is without a government, would have a life that is nasty, brutish, and short. It would be, in his words again, a war of all against all. He holds an extremely negative view of humanity then, where submission to a government is rational because without government there would be violent anarchy, and I mean anarchy in the common meaning here, not in the political meaning. Thomas Henry Huxley, 1825-1895, was an English biologist and anthropologist specializing in comparative anatomy. He has become known as Darwin's bulldog for his advocacy of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. At points in his career, he adopted ideas later associated with social Darwinism and believed strongly in humans' natural tendency to compete. Later in his career, he did modify that position, arguing that culture was developed to counteract the conflict inherent in competition. Ethics were inherited, and they were not in any way natural to man. Ethics were created when man struggled against his natural instincts. Ethics and other ideas that survived and became a part of our culture was a result of a survival of the fittest type selection process. In essence, a position very common with Hobbes. Men are inherently unethical, they're selfish, they're destructive, and they're greedy, and as a result, authority and tradition are good. In this passage, Bob is debunking these notions. He is saying that these thinkers are taking this pessimistic view of mankind because they've been raised in periods of awful revolution. Hobbes through the period of the English Civil War and Huxley through the Industrial Revolution. Both periods were of intense oppression, violence, and the worst in man was on full display. Bob is pointing out that had Hobbes had a chance to view the Native Americans in their natural state, he wouldn't be so pessimistic. And he points out that Kropotkin was writing his book, Mutual Aid, around the same time as Huxley, but reached a dramatically different conclusion. The difference being that one was living in a full-bore workaholic Victorian England, and the other was studying the cooperative society in Siberia. Peter Kropotkin, born in 1842 and died in 1921, he was a Russian anarchist, socialist, revolutionary, economist, sociologist, historian, zoologist, political scientist, human geography, philosopher, who advocated anarcho-communism. He was also an activist, an essayist, a researcher, and a writer. From a Wikipedia article on Kropotkin, quote, "The essays, initially published in the English periodical The 19th Century between 1890 and 1896, explore the role of mutually beneficial cooperation and reciprocity, or mutual aid, in the animal kingdom and human societies both past and present. It is an argument against theories of social Darwinism that emphasize competition and survival of the fittest, and against the romantic depictions by writers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who thought that cooperation was motivated by universal love. Instead, Kropotkin argues that mutual aid has pragmatic advantages for the survival of human and animal communities, and, along with the conscience, has been promoted through natural selection," close quote. Kropotkin believes that humans are not naturally good nor naturally bad, but that we're social animals and our evolution has driven us in a way that we cooperate because it's a more successful survival strategy than competing. So, a society based on cooperation would be a more healthy and a more normal one. Bob's example here about English settlers defecting to Indians is a really interesting one. I'm not sure how prevalent this was, and to be honest, couldn't find any immediate sources to further elucidate the idea. But I do know that when the French were first settling their North American colonies, they attempted to install the same feudal system as in France. It failed because the peasants would simply abscond into the woods. I also know that Canada has a sizable population of Métis, the descendants of mixed French and native populations, suggesting that Europeans were quite comfortable with the local inhabitants from relatively early in the colonization. Now, I do refuse to speculate on who was influencing whom in that particular case, but there was a relationship. Here, though, I am going to equivocate and not wholeheartedly support Bob's native argument. While I think his basic argument is solid, I do get a bit uncomfortable with pointing to primitive societies, quote-unquote primitive societies, like the first peoples of North America, as ideals of humanity. I know that the noble savage trope is highly resented by native peoples. They're people, and they did live in a relatively devolved political system, at least compared to Europe of the time. But they were not savages, and they were only as noble as humans can be. They did not live in perfect harmony with nature, and it is unknown how destructive they might have become had they continued to change without any interference. So while they were far from perfect, they also were not living in some destructive, violent dystopia. And in many ways, the average native was probably living a better life than comparable lower-class Europeans at the same time. So I guess I'm reaching for a bit of balance here. On the one hand, I think Bob does prove his point that compared against a European highly authoritarian government system, certainly the native peoples of North America did not live in a worse situation. Therefore, this bowing to authority and our type of work life is not necessarily any type of advantage. But on the flip side, I would never try to hold up the native peoples of North America as some example of a better way of life necessarily. Quote, the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins surveyed the data on contemporary hunter-gatherers, exploded the Hobbesian myth in an article entitled The Original Affluent Society. They work a lot less than we do, and their work is hard to distinguish from what we regard as play. Sahlins concluded that hunters and gatherers work less than we do, and rather than a continuous travail, the food quest is intermittent, leisure abundant, and there's a greater amount of sleep in the daytime per capita per year than in any other condition of society. They worked an average of 4 hours a day, assuming they were working at all. The labor, as it appears to us, was skilled labor, which exercised their physical and intellectual capacities. Unskilled labor on any large scale, as Sahlins says, is impossible except under industrialism. Thus, it satisfies Friedrich Schiller's definition of play, the only occasion on which man realizes his complete humanity by giving full play to both sides of his twofold nature, thinking and feeling. As he puts it, the animal works when deprivation is the mainspring of his activities, and it plays when the fullness of its strength is this mainspring, when superabundant life is its own stimulus to activity. A modern version, dubiously developmental, is Abraham Maslow's counterposition of deficiency and growth motivation. Play and freedom are, as regards production, coextensive. Even Marx, who belongs, for all his good intentions, in the productivist pantheon, observed that the realm of freedom does not commence until the point is passed where labor, under the compulsion of necessity and external utility, is required. He never could quite bring himself to identify this happy circumstance as what it is, the abolition of work. It's rather anomalous, after all, to be pro-worker and anti-work, but we can. Close quote. Marshall David Sahlins was born December 27, 1930, and died very recently in April 5th, 2021. He was an American cultural anthropologist, best known for his ethnographic work in the Pacific and for his contributions to anthropological theory. He was the Charles F. Gray Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and of Social Sciences at the University of Chicago. The Affluent Society was a published series of essays where Sahlins asserts that affluence is the satisfaction of wants, which may be easily satisfied either by producing much or desiring little. Given a culture characterized by limited wants, Sahlins argued that hunter-gatherers were able to live affluently through the relatively easy satisfaction of their material needs. This is an explicitly critical position versus our modern life with its endless wants and minimal satisfactions. In another quite clever dig at our current lifestyle, Bob points out how we're the only animal who satisfies its needs, food, shelter, safety, and society, then, rather than taking time to enjoy the fruits of our labors, we immediately turn back to more drudgery, to the production of more things that we don't need and to the benefit of people other than ourselves. Our only aim with all that is to hoard away a few more digits of imaginary currency on some bank ledger, or to pay off debt accumulated through the purchase and consumption of things that are often long gone and long forgotten. Bob turns to Friedrich Schiller's definition of the play drive to support an argument that this behavior is not consistent with instinctual humanity. Friedrich Schiller, 1759 to 1805, was a German playwright, poet, and philosopher. He was a close friend of Goethe and is considered by many to be Germany's most important classical playwright. He's sometimes considered to be Germany's Shakespeare. His idea is that man is made up of the eternal, which is consciousness and thought, because these philosophical and scientific capabilities are not bound in time. Facts, after all, exist regardless of time. But humanity is also made up of the finite, the experience and emotions, because they are reactions to life here and now. To give full rein to these two distinct parts of ourselves, we need to be free to express ourselves both emotionally and intellectually. But in most modern work, that's impossible. And without being too controversial, I think I can provide 25 years of empirical research in corporate work that in a modern corporation, emotions are suppressed and almost never expressed, except of course in some kind of passive-aggressive sabotage. And intellect, while theoretically welcome, is utterly subject to the deference of hierarchy. To be straightforward, it doesn't matter what you know, it matters who you know. Human beings have a need to be thinking, creating, and expressing, or emotional beings. But we are also dependent on having food, safety, rest, shelter, just like all animals. So we have to work to meet our basic needs, but once those are met, to be truly human, we should turn to satisfying our true nature. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The problem is simply, we don't. We are instead constantly focusing on creating more and more of the first, whether it be in the endless production of wealth or procuring stuff. And despite how much we have, we never express our humanity by taking time to satisfy our creative play needs, or in Maslow's words, our growth needs. This is, according to Bob, where pro-worker sentiment and anti-work sentiment meet. To be pro-worker demands that workers be given living wages and times off, while anti-work clarifies that once you worked enough to satisfy your basic needs, a healthy human should and would stop working to focus on more fulfilling things. So, I think that's enough for today. Like I said, that was a torrent of $10 words, delivered with all the eloquence of a physics professor. So if you come this far with me, then I'd like to compliment you, either on your big brain, or on the other hand, maybe I should keep it quiet and continue to let you sleep. My script for part 5 is underway, and I hope that I can release it in less than a week. This is XCG, wishing all of you a splendid, superlative, and contemplative sojourn on that spiritual avenue with destination freedom.